Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today. As we begin, can you say a few words about your company and your current role? What's in your purview?
Yeah, thanks, Misha. Well, my current company is Xactly. We're an intelligent revenue platform. We're backed by Vista Equity. And what was the second piece about my current?
What's what kind of functions roll up to you?
Well, so I'm the Chief Information Security Officer. I own privacy. I own business continuity, disaster recovery. Those tend to sometimes be separated outside the CISO role. Mm-hmm. And then I own all of the traditional risk management, architecture, compliance and audit as well. So I'm trying to think, traditional security operations and engineering also roll up to me.
I understand. And I noticed on your profile, you had quite a career in cybersecurity, both some of the very well-known brands like Crocs, for example, but also on the vendor side, Coldfire and whatnot. So, which is pretty amazing. They have kind of perspective both from the practitioner on the corporate side, but also the cybersecurity vendor side. But how did all that start for you? What was the impetus? How did you get into cybersecurity?
I got in by mistake. I went to school for computer electrical engineering time ago here in Boulder, Colorado. After graduating, I sat on the bench for way too long. And then I ended up getting a job writing code for a small 3D animation company that made it very clear in my mind I did not want to write code for a living. And so I interviewed for two things. On one hand, I was going to be a server at Chili's. And on the other hand, I was going to be a help desk guy for a company called Coldfire that was, I think, about $2 million in revenue at that time. And lucky for me, a mentor of mine, Tony Trishelle, offered me the job at Coldfire. And so away we went.
Awesome. That's an interesting story. Well, a few things have changed since those days. I think the threats graduated from teenagers in hoodies into state-sponsored, enterprise-size, well-resourced organizations. I think it's just, but also cybersecurity as a field has evolved, has grown so much. For no other indication that all the venture money that used to be going into space, it seems like up until now there was yet another company raising pretty substantial rounds of financing almost every other week. It's kind of stopped a little bit, but it's certainly, the space has evolved and grown pretty substantially. And I think as a result, a lot more people are making the right choice instead of Chili's going to something that's growing a lot faster. So for those, maybe some of the junior professionals who are looking at the space, or maybe looking to make a transition from technology to cybersecurity, there's just so many things that one can be doing, from certifications to networking. What are the 2 or 3 things you think some of the junior professionals should really focus on and double down and spend their time on to set them up for success in their career?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, when I started, it was pretty simple. There were firewalls and antivirus, right? And you can go back and watch movies by Matthew Broderick on the very simple kind of perspective that cybersecurity had back in the day. It's obviously blossomed into quite a diverse number of disciplines across the board. And so I think the question for me has always been to answer why first, and then to really kind of pursue how next. And so the first question would be, why would you pursue a career in cybersecurity? And in some cases, maybe it's money, right? Like, I think the compensation in cybersecurity is good, especially bridging out of IT. The demand is higher. And so the longevity in the career in the field is probably much more likely to have long-term sticky career prospects. But the first question for me is why? Why are we doing this? And then once you've got your why clear, I think pursuing the how by looking at the various disciplines. So, a role as a cybersecurity SOC engineer or architect or GRC person, like those roles are all very different. And they all can take you to the CISO seat, but some more likely than others will get you into the CISO seat if that's the goal. I think looking maybe a little bit further past just what is my next role is probably pretty important. And then I think leveraging some of the research that's out there that really sets a foundation for how to tackle and think about this career transition is helpful. So Helen Patton, who's former OSU and I think with Cisco, wrote a fantastic book on career pathing. And I think sort of stepping back and looking at whole and then dissecting in all of the parts and then pulling back a complete picture on the whole parts whole, as a pattern that Stephen Covey has talked about for years, has always been an approach that I've taken. So if you think about the career pathing book from Helen as a whole, and then getting to your why and how next, because the nuances about, what skills you have today and where you'd like to go tomorrow are relevant, and then packaging that back up and going out into the market and finding the right role, I think is probably a pretty practical approach.
Certainly. And do you recommend that people try to get exposure to different areas of cybersecurity first? So kind of go broad but shallow, figure out what you can be passionate about for a long period of time, and then kind of double down on that as a first step? Or do you recommend kind of not kind of going deep right off the bat? The reason I'm asking this is that there is in topography, which is kind of a branch of mathematics, there is this known problem, the local maxima, when people try to optimize and they climb the mountain. Once they get to the peak, to the summit, they realize, well, there may be a bigger mountain that they haven't seen before, or it's not the one that they really want. So I'm just wondering if going broad is it something that you recommend for maybe junior professionals?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is the same story. Stephen Covey again talks about wrong jungle. So you're in the jungle with a hatchet and you're axing through, but you never take the time to climb the ladder and look around. Yeah. And so you finally get to the end of the jungle or whatever, and you declare that you're in the wrong jungle instead. So yeah, it's interesting. I think I would honestly give different advice for different folks. If you're early in your career and you have some perspective, and you're lacking perspective, definitely getting a broad perspective makes a lot of sense. The question is, how do you iterate through? For me, that was consulting. Like I had a chance to sit in the role for application auditing, in banking auditing, in pen testing, and on down the road. So I think having the opportunity to move around in a bunch of different seats in a consulting capacity was really practical for me. And it was practical for the business at that time because we were in heavy growth, and probably, smaller boutique company allows you to put on more hats than otherwise. So for me, that was the way that I iterated through a number of the different disciplines. But if you're, we'll say middle-aged and you're later in your career and you've got a robust IT background, and you enjoy technology, like taking a step back and saying, I want to be you're probably not going to go from DevOps engineer to GRC person, right? So the path for you is probably requires a little less exploration. You're going to leverage the existing skills that you've got, and then potentially add some additional skills to complement where you're headed. So maybe you add some perspective on Kubernetes and containers, and then you add some perspective on how do you secure these things, and you get more familiar with some tooling and traditional processes or something. So I could see where you're at is there's a path goal dependence, right? Where you're at is going to have a direct impact on where I would tell you to go. And also, quite frankly, where you can go, given just the constraints of marketplace and demand.
Certainly makes a lot of sense. It's going back to the point that cybersecurity field kind of is ever changing, ever evolving. What do you think are the top 3 challenges or threat vectors or issues that are top of mind for CISOs right now?
Well, gosh, I mean, look, there's been a lot of litigation recently. We've seen the SolarWinds uh, uh, process unfold. We've watched what happened with Joe Sullivan over at Uber. We've recognized that right now we're still kind of in the wild, wild west in a lot of ways. That people are looking for accountability, but the rules are not necessarily laid out. So there is, from a CISO perspective, a fair bit of personal liability that needs to be managed. It's part of the reason why after the acquisition of LogicWorks, I left the company, because the acquiring company wasn't going to give me the liability protections that I was looking for. So the first thing is, how as an individual can I have confidence that I'm going to be backed and protected by my organization, and that when a lot of times there is an inherent mismatch between what a CISO has to do and what the org is trying to do. And that's not because people are doing a bad job or because you haven't aligned your program. There's just some inherent differences between the direction an org is going to pull and the direction that cybersecurity is going to cause a CISO to have to implement.
And is it just a matter of the boards and the CEOs being more savvy in cybersecurity and just understand the landscape and understand that it's, well, on the one hand, there are no 100% guarantees, but also make CISOs properly resourced and aligned with what the organization is trying to do. So do you think it will self-correct down the line, this mismatch that you're talking about?
I think so. Next thing, I think that there's an evolution in terms of now there's an open dialogue around materiality, and we're starting to do things with cyber risk quantification in a more robust way. So the combination of a foundation, a legal framework, a legal foundation, plus really developing the discipline in a more scientific way around what is cybersecurity and how does that work and how does it relate to systemic risk. That's stuff that as an industry we're sorting out. And yeah, as we get that sorted out, I think what's reasonable and appropriate will become much more clear, right? Like people, the saying goes, what is pornography? You know it when you see it. Well, in cybersecurity, I don't know that we have that same thing today. What is a good cyber program? I think on one hand, you could say a very robust set of controls is a good program, but you could be spending way too much, especially if the stage of your company is an early stage company with cash flow issues, right? Whereas if you're a significantly backed and well-funded, financial institution with heavy margins, and what you need to do is protect those margins because that's where your company value is driven from, then it makes a lot more sense to have a more robust control set. And so when you say, what does good look like? I don't think that we as practitioners can honestly say there's a one size fits all that maps across the board.
Interesting. So this balancing of cybersecurity objectives and business objectives, it's stage specific. So for a mature organization, it looks a certain way, but for an early stage startup, it could be the trade-offs maybe somewhat different just based on where the company is in terms of the growth cycle, in terms of where it is just operationally.
Yeah, 100%. And Chris Castaldo has done a pretty decent job in his book called Startup Secure. Mm-hmm. I saw some early copies of the book. I forget if he kept all of this in there, but you can see a maturity cycle. And so early on, when you've just got your initial round of funding and what you need to do is get to product market fit, you have limited runway and you need to iterate quickly. Having super robust cybersecurity controls that slow you down or prevent you from getting to product market fit can be an existential flaw, right? And so that's a huge contrast versus where does JP Morgan or Citibank or Capital One, like the way that they think about risk management and cybersecurity is vastly different.
For sure. Well, it's kind of like, if you can move fast and break things, it's okay. If you're Facebook, you're iterating and you're just trying to figure out the product. Breaking anything when you're JP Morgan have vastly different consequences than for like a rapidly growing startup that's just iterating on the product, figuring out things as they go.
Yeah,
What are some of
100%.
the other things? That this is a very good point. I think it's certainly, we often hear that CISOs need to realize that even the corporate counsel represents the organization, and in certain instances, the CISO would need a counsel on their side that represents him or her as separate as the company, just given where some of those potential liability sets are, and some of the issues that are coming up. And it's certainly something that would make a lot of sense for executives to think ahead rather than to kind of build the bridge before you need it, kind of build this relationship, find someone who's reliable before you need someone like that.
I think it's something that we as an industry are sorting out. I think if you asked the number of CISOs that have a personal E&O policy in place to complement a pre-negotiated directors and officers coverage, the number is low. Like the people that have D&O and a personal E&O policy and have an ability with confidence to engage outside counsel and have that outside counsel paid for in some kind of meaningful way, there's not a lot of us out there that have that in place. And so then the question is, how many people actually have meaningful experience litigating in these situations? And you've got again, just a handful of cases that have actually been litigated, at least in a very public way on a national stage. And I think the individuals that have engaged in that have everybody has their own personal constraints, right? Like I remember when I took my role at LogicWorks, I hadn't been working for a year. We moved across the country, which was not free, in order to live in New York. And we started looking at the cybersecurity program. And if there had been a real challenging issue, it would have been very difficult to just walk away from an income, in a massive financial hole, right? And so I think when people are thinking about career transitions, those are not topics that get discussed, I think, openly. What is your personal situation, and how does making this commitment to, bridge up into the new title or whatever, impact your family, and what if things don't work out the way that you had hoped? So, and I'm certainly not the only person that's stretched for a role with career ambitions. And so I think in my case, I was fortunate, right? Like the company was interested in doing the right things, and we differentiated if you look back, we differentiated the entire company on cybersecurity, that led to a successful outcome, being a PE sale to a large privately held company. But that's not going to be the case for everyone, and those are sensitive moments in people's lives and people's careers that could put people in some really challenged financial positions.
Certainly. What are some of the other things, and kind of on the personal level, but also kind of broadly, some of the cybersecurity challenges they're facing organizations that CISOs are concerned about? What a couple of ones that kind of you think are top of mind for a lot of people?
Well, I mean, so I think we covered personal, so I'll focus on some other things. There's publicly traded and privately held companies, and I think they look and feel and behave quite differently.
Mm-hmm.
So my experience is more on the privately held side, so I won't necessarily speak to public, but without mentioning, I think I'd be remiss to not say the SEC is changing the game. They've just put forward some meaningful rules, and the industry is all over that, and there's been a lot of conversation about that. So we're going to see how that actually plays out in reality.
You mean the 4 days you have to report if there was a breach?
I think it's more than just disclosure timelines. I think that there's relevant discussion to be held about accountability and board reporting and the definition of materiality and a handful of other things. So yeah, anyway, I'm not in a publicly held company, and I haven't spent as much time as maybe I would like. So somebody else is probably more informed on that. On a privately held side, I do think that cyber risk quantification makes a ton of sense. Like I mentioned before, I think it's going to change the way that programs are designed and architected and operate. I think it's going to modify the way that the board level dialogue takes place. Yeah, and I think so I think people need to be paying attention to cyber risk quantification in a real meaningful way, because I think it is the future, and has been sort of clearly, in my opinion, written on the wall for the last 4 or 5 years since Rich Syrson wrote his book, The Green Book. That was, I think, the first initial step in the right direction. Him and Doug Hubbard put a mathematical approach to risk quantification, which has been applied in other disciplines for ages. And so I think understanding how to leverage cyber risk quantification in our programs, whether you're a $200 million company that's privately held, or whether you're a $200 billion company that's in the public sphere, cyber risk has an impact on everybody. Yeah, so personal liability, cyber risk quantification is probably the next one, and then digital transformation. Right, you can't get out of a conversation at the board level without talking about strategy. And the reason strategy is important is because 50% of S&P 500 is being disrupted. So 20 years ago, 50% of those S&P 500 companies don't exist anymore. And that concept of innovator's dilemma that Clayton Christensen came up with, quite a number of years ago, and taught out of Harvard for a decade or more, has people on edge, because boards know it's their responsibility to get strategy right, and if they screw it up, then their company, it's an existential risk that needs to be managed. And the path forward the shortcut has been digital transformation. And so the question on what is digital transformation and how does it impact your revenue and value streams, but then down the chain from there, how does it impact your technology platforms? And specifically, what does it mean to you from a cybersecurity practitioner, becomes super, super relevant. And so, you can throw all this Gen AI stuff, in my opinion, right into digital transformation for a lot of reasons. Many people have converted digital transformation to a move to the cloud, but I think we need to expand the definition of digital transformation in a more robust way. And in that regard, I think my third issue would be digital transformation. So personal liability, cyber risk quantification, and I think the third one is digital transformation.
It's interesting. I just want to kind of pull in a few threads here in terms of the quantification of cyber risk. I would imagine that insurance companies will be the first ones to have very tight grip on quantifying risk, because they, at the end of the day, they need to price their policies. But what recently we're seeing is that a lot of them, either they're jacking the rates, the premiums up, or some organizations is completely walking away, which makes me wonder if they who allegedly are paid to quantify the risk, if they're capable of doing so correctly. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a stage in the maturity, right? So just put yourself in the insurer, the underwriter's position. Either your quantification efforts are good, and you can have confidence that you've underwritten the right policies, or you don't know, and so your rates go up higher because you're taking on a financial risk that's very uncertain to you. And if it's so uncertain, then you might step away. And then I think the other thing that's happening in the cyber security insurance space is people are doing land grabs, and that's happened over the last 4 or 5 years. So traditionally, when you look at the CFO's relationship with the insurance companies and the brokers that they deal with, those are 10, 15, 20, 50-year relationships. And so the idea is that you get in the door, maybe you lost a couple $100,000 on a relationship out of the gate, or even $1 million. But over time, if you're going to retain that relationship, your business performance from an insurance industry perspective is going to be like you're capturing market share today, which will translate it into some short-term losses. Is it okay to have short-term losses while you grow market share? Yes. And then what happens in the long term is you right size that business as the industry sort of normalizes and becomes more mature. And so you've got a foothold in the door and you own that policy over an extended period of time. And I think we're kind of in a transition between those few dynamics of land grab plus maturing cyber risk quantification, resulting in sort of a stable growth business for these insurance providers.
Certainly. Well, switching gears a little bit, I kind of going back to where we started, that you have very interesting experience because you have a number of companies were on the kind of corporate side, private, but you also had experience with some of the cybersecurity vendors like Coalfire, for example, and whatnot. So you kind of have perspective into both worlds, the cybersecurity vendors and practitioners. And kind of in this regard, I have a couple of questions. I think a lot of people believe that with the economic headwinds and some kind of string of recent acquisitions, there is some consolidation going on. And I think a lot of CISOs are welcoming that. I hear that some organizations have 50 plus vendor relationships they're dealing with. And I cannot even imagine someone or a team even looking at 50 different dashboards and trying to make sense of them and worrying about how they interoperate with each other and whether adding a new tool would improve the cybersecurity posture or actually take away from it, or it could become a vector of an attack. What is your sense? Do you think in the end of the day they will have 2-3 players left standing and we'll see more unified and integrated cybersecurity solutions, or you think it will continue to be, if you look at RSA, was it 400 sponsors? I think Black Hat was along the same lines. Will we continue to see fairly kind of dispersed and not fully integrated landscape?
Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion is we're still in a boom growth for cyber, and during growth, you're going to see fragmented industries. When we stabilize, that's when you see consolidation, right? And you see businesses that are more cyclical with very mature industries. Like you see a bunch of acquisition and you see this consolidation, and then it's difficult to find opportunities to really have disruptive technologies. We're so far from that. I mean, there's no, between, some of the dynamics that we just talked about, we can't as an industry agree how cyber risk management should take place, much less than all of the technology implementations underneath those high-level strategy decisions. And so for a long time, in my opinion, we're going to see a very fragmented industry where you have, if we're honest, some players just building a feature set that they're going to sell to a platform, right? And all they have to do is be disruptive enough to force one of the large players to gobble them up. And we've seen a whole bunch of them. You've seen Help Systems, and you've got ForgePoint, and you've got Palo Alto Networks and Trend Micro and all the rest. Like everybody, a lot of innovation, but also a bunch of acquisitions to just pull in feature sets in order to make their solution complete. So I think we're going to continue to see a pretty robust quantity of vendors in the vendor landscape for quite some time. And even though a lot of cybersecurity professionals are now starting to talk along the lines of cost consolidation, and those cost consolidations are a natural result of the economic cycle, right? We saw people, we saw the rates go up. We saw people tighten their belts. We saw an entire series of industries transition from grow at all costs to now we need to pay attention to EBITDA. And we saw the SaaS industry go on these wild swings where many of these companies, really good companies, Okta and Datadog and HashiCorp and all these in these public markets, they're all down 60 to 80% during this time. It's not because their products suck or because demand for their products disappeared. It's just an economic cycle that is happening.
The measuring stick has changed. If you're discounting cash flows at the 0%, that's your value is infinite. But if it's 5 or 6, it just changes the math pretty dramatically. Yes, I see on the secondary some of those offerings for the companies you mentioned. As you said, it's like 60 to 80% haircut, which is, I mean, changes a lot of things. It changes the comp internally, because if people are incentivized by stock options, it's a pretty steep climb from there to make people whole. So it changes a lot of things, which I guess, to your point, the Trend Micro and the Palo Altos and Checkpoints of this world, I think they'll have a field day down the line with some of those the best of breed companies. Again, probably not right now, but maybe 6 months from now, 12 months from now, I guess we'll see.
Yeah, and I think assets are discounted, and I don't know that those asset discounts are gonna stay as low as they are today forever, but certainly, I mean, I think there's a long slog forward, and to say cash is going to be free or we're going to go back to 0% interest rates anytime soon is not supported by long-term economic evaluation, right? If you just look at the history, like go do a tour at the Fed in New York, and you'll see that sort of 10-year cycle repeats itself over and over and over. So I don't have confidence that free cash is coming back anytime soon. And for all of those reasons, I do think we'll see a bunch of acquisitions, but I still think we're immature enough as an industry that there's plenty of space for disruptive innovation, and that will continue for a long time.
Interesting. Well, since we're talking about the future, if you had a crystal ball and you can see clearly what's going to happen, you think at 12 months from now, maybe 24 months from now, what are the 2-3 things CISOs will be anxious about, concerned about, worried about? It could be some of the same, but maybe is it going to continue to be cloud security, or is it going to be AI? What do you think? What will be the headlines that will shake people up a little bit?
I think a number of folks have said this already, so this is not my own prophecy here, but the generative AI arc is probably, we're according to Gartner, we're in the height of inflated expectations, and we're going to see that come down. I've heard a number of people say generative AI, because of the visceral interaction with it that people have had via ChatGPT, has opened up a dialogue that's given us the opportunity to finally have the right conversation on broader sets of AI investments that have the potential to drive meaningful economic value into businesses. So what's going to happen is the generative AI conversation opened up conversations on more basic machine learning and other forms of AI. Many of those investments will finally get the funding and resources and attention to move forward. Mm-hmm. And those make sense because you're going to create efficiencies inside the business, which is going to drive, more retained earnings or stronger EBITDA, or however you want to call that. And at the end of the day, that's healthy for all of the businesses who have been sort of stuck and unable to move those forward. I think the other thing that's going to impact a number of folks is probably depends on how the presidential election plays out here in the United States. And I think, probably those are two of the big things that we're talking about. What does the economic trend and picture look like? And then what does the technology trend and picture look like? Those are probably two big buckets to look at. Interesting.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. What's the best, as we're coming up on time, what's the best way for people to find you?
You can go to CISOevolution.com. Actually, I think there's links. There's an About the Authors page, and you can hit me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Awesome. That's probably one great way. And then obviously, if we're already connected on LinkedIn, then we can interact via that. And oftentimes what I'll do is move conversations over. I have invested in a personal Calendly link. So happy to meet with folks who are interested in discussing these topics or the book or whatever.
Interesting. And so CISO evolution, I want to, can you put it to the camera so it just people can see the
Yeah. No, that's
awesome.
good. Yeah.
Business knowledge for cybersecurity executives. I think it's very, very on point for this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of the, the process of writing the book and the research that went in there, formulates a lot of the foundational thinking and probably feeds into the conversation that we just had. So
awesome. Well, if it's okay, we'll include a link. I assume it's on Amazon, right?
It is, yeah. It's published by Wiley, so it's in all major retail locations. Here in the UK, we've got folks in Singapore and Israel who have purchased through a number of different distributors. So it's basically available wherever you want to get a book.
Awesome. Well, Matthew, thank you so much. This was lots of fun. This was awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Yeah. Take care, Misha. Bye.